I think that's two quite interesting views that kind of dovetail together quite interestingly. One of the things that I'm going to draw from that as I pass on to Carolyn is the question about, you talk about manifestation in the real world. And one of the questions that keeps coming up around social media is the tools with which we use to measure the effectiveness of marketing activity using social media networks. And when we've talked about it, one of the things that we can get trapped into is thinking about just how that operates within the idiom of the internet itself. And one of the other questions that then comes out of that is how did that then transfer back into that last mile and into the real world? Carolyn, you've spoken a bit to me in the past about measurement questions. How does that fit with local and social from your point of view?
Around the whole question of measuring ROI, I think the measurement of ROI on social media is a challenge, and I'm not sure that any of us have actually nailed it, to be fair. I think there's lots of ways in which to do it. One of them is to use buzz tracking tools and measure share of voice by geo-targeting, by sentiment, by volume, and via source. Another way is to have an SEO element to a campaign. So you can track via links, via traffic, via stickiness, via engagement with the site, or tracking to conversions. So if you have a car client, a conversion is signed up to test drive or brochure requests, or a bank is signed up to a current account. And I think for me, social media needs to work as part of your total media mix. So it needs to amplify all other types of media and drive the effectiveness of it. And I don't think it should be thought of as in isolation in that way. So, but I know that we talked about how do you measure the impact of reading a blog or a forum entry and then tracking footfall into a store to buy a particular product. And quite frankly, we're not there. With the advent of mobile, we're certainly starting to move into that space, but there's obviously a lot of work to be done in this particular area.
Okay. To pass on to Paul, I think one of the I touched on the 6 weeks project in the introduction. One of the things that comes from that is you kind of turn that discussion round in the opposite direction and thought about in terms of if as consumers we influence the likelihood of other people interacting with a particular brand, how does that value exchange, how does that work? Could you perhaps share a little of your experience on that with the group?
Sure. So just as an introduction to 6 weeks, I basically invoiced over 50 companies that I spent time with during a 6-week period to pay me for my time with them, to try and challenge a few consumer expectations and consumer behaviour models. And a number of them decided to pay me for my time, including Pret a Manger, Pizza Express, and Little Chef, though please don't judge me on that one. And I think one of the interesting things about it was that I used various online and social media tools that empowered me as a consumer and also their customer in ways to challenge these companies that perhaps they wouldn't have been used to 5 years ago or even prior to that. So I recorded all of my data that I collected in terms of my time using a site called Datum. I used Twitter to challenge the brands directly, as well as emailing them and phoning them in some cases to see how joined up they were, and also to see how active they were and proactive on Twitter. And then also my own blog as well. And it meant that there was a community gradually building up around my maverick consumer behaviour in that case. And that was something that then these companies had to deal with and respond to. I think just touching on some of the definitions so far of local and social, a few of the things that interest me are around how everyone is always local. We are always local, and that's sometimes kind of stepped over, but whether we're in this room or in a community or on a street in a residential area or in an airplane, we're always local. And so that for me creates opportunities, and obviously there's a divergence with that in social media, because obviously online there are no boundaries in theory, and so it's a global audience that can impact local decisions. When you're in that physical local space, as Sokratis was talking about, how non-local people and non-local factors through social media can impact the choices you make locally. And that, for me, is an interesting thing to look at, and opportunities that come out of it.
Okay. I'd like to take that and think a little bit more from the brand's point of view. if brands are trying to use social media, in other words, trying to use content that's generated by people, you describe your activity as being somewhat maverick. We've seen some quite startling information already this morning about how many people are actually there sharing information, how many friends they have. If the numbers are so small of the people who have these kinds of big networks, and we're trying to generate user-generated content from these people, how are we getting that to happen? How are we finding those mavericks? How important is it to unlock those mavericks' contribution to the social network that we're working in? How do we do that, and how does that then play back? And that's a fairly open question for the panel. Carolyn.
I think that individuals naturally form groups, whether that's motivated by fear of being alone or whether that's wanting to be part of something bigger. And I think there are infinite groups, and I think groups have different characteristics from individuals. So it's what Seth Godin refers to as tribalism in its truest form, and it's about how we earn time with those groups and how we unlock the influencers or the gatekeepers. So I've done a lot of work with brands like Unilever and Nestle, and so it's specifically targeting women. And done a lot of research, and I thought that the research that was presented this morning was really fascinating. I think the next stage is about how you measure influence, and I don't think that quite went as far as how far I'd like it to go, to put it that way. But women are interesting. You have a situation where you get what I call, and this isn't meant derogatory in any way, but silverback females, and they own these groups. And whereas women used to ask their mothers or their grandmothers or their sister or their friends about which product to buy, how to find information on something, they now ask these silverback females within these groups, and they act as thought leaders, as key influencers. And the challenge for brands like Unilever and Nestle and other female brands is how you understand what those influence, who they are, what they want, how they want to be communicated with, and how you earn time with them, and what you need to give them in terms of a value exchange in order to be able to advocate a particular brand or be on the side of that particular brand. And I do agree with the comment made earlier that there's a lot of spamming going on. There's lots of what I would call bordering unethical activities in this space, and I think we're at risk of destroying those relationships if we don't manage it on the basis of a value exchange.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to answer this in a generic way because it depends who the brand is, what the product, what the message, what it is they're trying to get across. I don't think user-generated content is necessarily, if you like, an answer to a brand's problems or to a brand's aspirations. It may be. I would be, from our experience, I would be quite careful about associating the actual contribution or buzz or whatever it is you want to call it that actually impacts on the activity that happens within a community, to actually associate that with some ROI measurements, with some campaign objectives, and it is. And part of the reason for that is that you cannot be sure of the outcome, B, the risk associated with that, both for the brand and also for the community that you're trying to reach. What I'd say is that relevancy is actually really important, which automatically restricts, if you like, the audience that you can appeal to. The way that you approach those spaces and you engage with them, again, is something Caroline said, that you do have to be quite careful, and we've seen a number of examples of people getting it horribly, horribly wrong. But having said that, when it comes to local, I don't think necessarily that user-generated content, if you like, is the main component. If somebody, I don't know, tweets 100x what they would usually tweet about a specific place or a specific brand, or writes X amount of comments, reviews, this is all interesting stuff. But what is perhaps more interesting for us is how do brands that already spend a lot of their money on TV, a lot of money on print, a lot of their money on traditional display, how do they take those budgets and they actually go a step further and they optimize what they're doing at the local level? Just a simple example, right? I don't see why Boots, for example, cannot create an online campaign that is localized. And what I mean by that is that the message is tied into the location that it is displayed again.